when I started writing on Pakistan, I realized that most of the writing that had been done to date on the Islam part of Pakistan sort of emphasized the fact that there wasn't a unitary vision of Islam, and that there wasn't even a consensus that it should be an Islamic country versus a Muslim majority country. And while all of those were historically true, what ended up happening is that most of the writing tended to portray this lack of consensus as though it was an inherent problem intrinsic to Pakistan, right? In the sense that Pakistan was just a confused mess. And what I was interested in doing was not necessarily to suggest that no, of course there was coherence, but rather to say, do we have to see a lack of consensus, a lack of a shared collective vision as necessarily a bad thing? Right? Is there a way to approach this to understand that there was not just a lack, but that there may have been a plethora of imaginations of all the different things that Pakistan could be, and that is the promise that people invested in, not a very clear-cut, end point, but a process of being open to different ways of imagining Islam, different ways of being Muslim, and so on. So that was really the sort of instinct from which I approached my research and the analysis. The other thing that I found was that, I wanted to not necessarily replay a certain kind of standard political science narrative, which is that if the top is not extremely authoritative in terms of its sovereignty, then what you have is a vacuum and people trying to fill the vacuum. And society's worst elements or politics' worst elements coming into that vacuum. I was very tired of this way of describing. I was thinking, if we can describe it otherwise, it's not as though the story changes, but that maybe our line of engagement changes. And so what I wanted to suggest was that, the context in which I found Pakistan was a Pakistan which was very riven by sectarian violence, right? And instead of just seeing this about a scramble for that vacuum, I tried to see it as maybe not a good after effect, but maybe an after effect of the process of experimentation over what it is to be Muslim, with which the country had started, right? And to see how it is that experiments sometimes have bad outcomes, sometimes have good outcomes, right? But to be able to embrace the fact that there is experimentation going on, and that what people are fighting over are not just about control over this turf or controlling this number of people, etc., or their votes, but rather also visions of how society should be organized. And so that was my way of linking the present that I found in Pakistan in the late 1990s with Pakistan at its formation in 47. One other thing that is important to keep in mind is that I was born and raised in Bangladesh. And so I really did not have any investment in the idea of Pakistan as such. I wasn't raised with that investment. In fact, I was raised to be highly critical of Pakistan. So on one hand, for my own personal self, I was very interested to see if I could study a country about which I had mixed feelings as a nationalist subject, but that I could study as an intellectual, as understanding and reading and analyzing the records in their own terms. But the other thing that I actually found in the process of doing that was not objectivity as such, but a realization that Bangladesh as it is today was actually all the people in Bangladesh who formed East Pakistan before it became Bangladesh were equally interested in the idea of Pakistan, right? And that there was an investment in this idea that this country could be this new space for experimentation. And of course, the formation of Bangladesh points to the fact that that wasn't necessarily the outcome for Bangladesh, right? And that has consequences for Bangladesh, but that's a separate matter. But the point is that it was a way to weave Bangladesh back into the history of Pakistan, right? To see that it wasn't just a misgotten situation, that there was equal investment and then the investments changed, right? So I went in to study the climate negotiations from the context of Bangladesh, because I was already doing field work in Bangladesh in a riverine society, and I met someone in that context who had been to these negotiations, and I thought that was very interesting how somebody from my field side, which is a very poor field site, could have ended up at this international level. And so it was really to follow that path. I went to the negotiations. The first one I went to was in Paris in 2015, which turned out to be quite consequential because that was where the Paris Agreement was framed. And the whole time I was there, that first time at the COPs, I found it to be a very alienating experience, because it was not, if you know anything about the UN, it's all people in like suits and boots and talking this very abstract UN language, right? And so as a result, I stayed very close to Bangladesh because I wanted to have some feeling of like a touchdown to reality. And the Bangladeshis, there who were there as activists or NGO workers or the negotiators, were constantly making references to a national context that I understood, right? And so they made the whole negotiations come to life for me a little bit. But as I spent more time with them, I realized that Bangladesh wasn't in a marginal position here. I had thought that they'd be in a very marginal position because it's such a small country and it's not necessarily very influential in geopolitics as such. What I realized was that Bangladesh really occupied a kind of important moral space within the negotiations, as among the handful of countries that were sort of in the forefront of climate change, right? And your own Jason Cons has written a lot about how Bangladesh has, in some ways, played the role of both victim, but also been open to the kinds of new opportunities, investment opportunities that such a disaster capitalism might also allow. Right. And so, I realized that Bangladesh was playing quite an influential role in terms of this kind of performance of both victimhood and opportunity. Right. And that in a way they was creating a template that was being followed by other smaller countries, least developed countries. Right. So they were playing a leadership role, which wasn't necessarily obviously that of industrialized countries that were needing to, mitigate their economies, nor that of the large developing countries like Brazil, India, China, who were berating the developed countries for not doing more in terms of mitigation, but who were themselves also now facing pressure to mitigate their own economies. That Bangladesh and other least developed countries were playing this role that was sort of the moral role, saying we are the ones who are caught in between your geopolitical struggle, right? So, we have a right to both speak to the industrialized countries and to berate them and push the developing countries to do more. Right. And so that was kind of an interesting strategic position that Bangladesh was playing. And that was also the position from which it took up the issue of loss and damage. Loss and damage was previously an issue for small island nations, specifically those in the Pacific that were convinced, and rightly so, that any rise of ocean waters was going to inundate those countries. People were going to lose their nations. They were going to be transported, in the millions out of these small island nations. So they had been going on about loss and damage for decades. But suddenly, as Bangladesh was trying to figure out how to play this role of a moral authority, it realized that loss and damage actually help them play that role better. Previously, loss and damage had been positioned as a stick, right? The carrot is, if you mitigate, then you have a more efficient economy. If you don't mitigate, then there will be damage, right? And people will sue you for that damage. This is what was being said to industrialized country. But Bangladesh actually took a very important step in saying that we know that there's going to be loss, there's going to be damage, right? We know that it'll be hard to fight in the legal courts as to who is to be blamed, right? But loss, just think about what it means in terms of human suffering, right? So they kind of depoliticized it a little bit, and they amped the sort of like the suffering part of it, right? And then it became a really major issue behind which all these small countries could band, right? And so it had a mild threat still, which is that if you don't pay attention to our suffering, you're going to end up with legal cases. But if you actually make the right kind of moves now, not only in terms of mitigating, but also in terms of solidarity payments, helping with building up our infrastructure, sharing your technology with us, and not being so concerned about intellectual property rights, etc., right? You can avert these legal repercussions, right? So in a way, Bangladesh did two sorts of things. One, it fashioned this moral position, right? Depoliticized loss and damage, but also made loss and damage a wider issue by which to create a bigger consensus in the middle, so as to put pressure on both these sides, right? The developed and the developing. So what I would say is that, I had come to study Bangladesh from the perspective of someone who had just finished her work on Pakistan, and so therefore as an anthropologist of religion, right? And so that was already an unusual place to come from in terms of studying the environment in Bangladesh. Bangladesh is, a very NGOized country. Everybody speaks in policy talk. And so the environment was very much in terms of like climate indices, adaptation, and so on. And I was coming at it as someone who's interested in, like, how are people's notion of the good death changing? How are people thinking about the afterlife? How are people having, prophetic dreams in the context of a changing climate, and so on. So right away, the fact that I was coming from a anthropology of religion perspective meant that I was able to enter into the sort of sites of everyday life that the usual scholars or researchers of the environment in Bangladesh just were not doing. They just didn't think those were places where climate change was touching. They have a very practical orientation, which is absolutely not wrong, which is that, climate change is going to affect, crops, it's going to affect floods, and so on. And so I was also trying to bridge those two perspectives, and therefore also paid attention to things like, temperature and water and water shortage and desertification and so on. And the other thing is that what I found really interesting is bringing the environment to traditional questions of religion, right? So in the first instance, I was in some ways thinking that I was coming at environment from a different perspective, but I was also interested in how it is that looking at usual religious issues or issues of intercommunal tensions from the perspective of environment might yield different perspective. Right? So the usual story is that Bangladesh is majority Muslims, the Hindus are a minority, they are very put upon, there's a lot of discrimination, certainly invisibilizing in the public sphere and so on, right? But the story always paints it as though there's an active discrimination. And what I found in my field site is that the nature of discrimination is far more subtle and long term. Right? It's about how people forget about shared lives together. It's about how when the land breaks because of floods or because of erosion, when the land comes back, how other people don't come back, and how they come to be excluded from the society that springs up again. Right? And so then the next generation already doesn't have a memory of the first, So basically what I thought I was doing is sort of a cross-fertilization of questions from the perspective of religious studies on the environment and environmental framings of issues that seemed very fraught, religiously speaking, in the context of Bangladesh. And I mean, I felt that in some ways it was it was reopening those issues again, so that the question couldn't be just posed in terms of like, how do Bengali Muslims here discriminate against Hindus, which is not what they were doing, but they were forgetting them, and it was a convenient kind of forgetting, right? And so how then do we really think about the issue of discrimination in a more nuanced fashion, right? That is a hard question. So one thing that I wanted to break out of, in part because I'm not a historian, right, is that I didn't want to be straight-jacketed by historicist concerns with exactly mapping the influence of, say, a period or a person on another person. Because then it ties you to a picture of history which is just exactly progressing into the future, a certain arrow of time, whereas in truth, we know that history, once forgotten, is reanimated by things happening in the present, right? So, new life is given to different periods, different figures, different texts by things that are happening in the present. So there is a far more greater feedback loop that we have considered in the way in which ideas are transmitted and relationships forged, right, between texts, people, ideas, and so on, right? So that's what I was trying to get at with that article. I was trying to say that everyone who's written about Iqbal and Goethe, a well examined relationship, has put it in the form of how did Iqbal ever get access to Goethe? How did he read Goethe? How was he influenced by Goethe? But never in terms of how Goethe might have been influenced by Iqbal. Now, of course, historically we know that's impossible. However, the fact of the matter is that, till Iqbal came along and read Goethe, right, and not just Goethe, the poet or the author, but also, the literary author, but also the scientist, right? That a certain kind of Goethe doesn't come to be alive in South Asia, right? The Goethe of colors, the Goethe of optics, right? The Goethe of plants, in some ways come to be reanimated by Iqbal's particular interest in Goethe. Right? I mean, of course, Goethe isn't around to appreciate it, but I'm sure Goethe scholars appreciate the way in which Goethe gets reanimated in new ways by Iqbal's interest in particular traditions of Goethe. And so what I wanted to point to was, and here I was drawing a little bit on Walter Benjamin and in the way in which he understands how it is that certain kind of folds in time can happen through attractions between eras or epochs, as he calls them, right? And so I was trying to suggest an epochal sort of like relationship between Iqbal and Goethe, that time and this time of Iqbal. So that's basically what I was trying to do there. But also, even more than that, what I wanted to show was how it is that somebody like Iqbal, right, writing and thinking in a context of colonial India, where there is a certain kind of stereotyping going on of the Indian Muslim, right? He wants to both be a pious Muslim, right? He doesn't want to betray Islam, but at the same time, he wants to suggest that it is a dynamic religion and that it is well capable of embracing and engaging the thoughts of others, right? And so he really does that, I claim, in a very sophisticated way in his poem. in front of the one on Cordoba, right? Which is that he doesn't want to enliven it as an object, because that would be shirk in some ways for somebody like him. Not in a strong sense, but like it would go against his tendencies, right? But at the same time, he wants to show how it stirs people, the people who go to see it, how it stirred him, how he's felt it as a lively space, right? And so the way in which he does that in that poem, I thought was quite masterful. And in a way, it had the same kind of empiricism of somebody like Goethe, who doesn't want to just extrapolate, just project a kind of mystical vitality to plants, right? But he wants to acknowledge that plants have an orientation, a normative orientation, right? And so, in some ways, Iqbal really taps into Goethe's ability to do a scientific animation of what is not a human, right? A non-human. So I don't know if that answers your question. It's a very dangerous question because we could be here for a long time. Because now that I finished, the river book and the climate negotiation books, everybody's like, please take a break. I really don't want to read yet another thing by you quite so soon. And so I have actually taken this as an opportunity to sit on something that is almost finished. Because I don't feel that the argument satisfies me fully. So what I've been sitting on is data that I collected while I was doing the River Life work, which is householding data. And I want to actually explore how we can think about climate change within the sinews of households, within interrelations, and within provisioning, calculations on food, etc. What I want to say, I haven't quite pinned it down, is that how it is numbers are as important as affect is. People have made such a swing to the affective, that they forget that there are many other things through which people express. It's not one given mode at any given time, right? It's a very heterogeneous human communication is. So how it is that in Bangladesh, at a particular moment, what we find is that numbers may be the ways in which something like climate change is being expressed, not the numbers of abstraction, not the numbers of earth systems and so on, but rather the numbers of, how much food, how many children, how much land, water. Paul Koppelman in a nice book called Quanta, like unabstracted numeration or equivalencing in which we're immersed in on a daily basis, right? And again, extending this back to some earlier thoughts that I shared with you, quanta can also be used to talk about people's anxieties, growing anxieties about whether it's even possible to lead a good life, or whether it's possible to have done enough good merits to warrant access to, to behest in reality. And so I find that quite interesting. So that's what I'm working on. And also, as you know, the very exciting things have been happening in Bangladesh. So I've been following that and writing on that a little bit. So those are the two things that are keeping me busy right now.